Now, if you've been watching my channel for any real length of time, you may know that I'm not a huge fan of the concept of Gray Jedi, or this idea that the optimal way the Jedi are supposed to use the Force is a sort of balance between the dark and the light, that they're supposed to embrace a larger view of the Force and not reject the dark side, but learn to accept and even wield it. The problem with this, though, is that, contrary to the belief of some, the Jedi do accept that the dark side exists, or at least they should or are supposed to. It's not so much that they reject its existence, they only reject the idea that it should be used and embraced, which is because no good is bound to come from it, and it offers nothing that a full devotion to the light side does not, other than maybe some unnatural abilities. And nowhere is this better showcased than in the Yoda arc during Season 6 of the Clone Wars, where Yoda is forced to face and accept the darkness within himself, which is actually how he defeats it. You could even almost say he learns to no longer be afraid of his fear, as strange as that sounds, and it's this acceptance that even allows him to start down the path of becoming a Force ghost. And so, without getting into a full-blown discussion here, what must be understood about balance is it is not equal parts light to dark. It's not like a scale where you need so much on one side and then so much on the other side for things to be equal. Instead, balance in this context in Star Wars is about harmony. It's about a system working as intended. And the dark side is not something the Jedi deny as much as something they reject because, again, it offers them nothing of use or value. Not to mention, there is the inherent risk that comes from using the dark side, which is falling to it. In other words here, a Gray Jedi is a fundamentally flawed idea. We can see that from the outside looking in large part because we have the luxury of knowing what the creator of Star Wars has said about the Force and how it works. A luxury that characters in-universe obviously do not have, and thus I'm fine and even find it intriguing when characters in-universe ask these very difficult questions or begin to ponder what is the proper way to use the Force. Should the dark side be rejected outright, or maybe explored and utilized to some degree? It's also interesting when, again, in-universe, Jedi question such things as attachments, and if they really should exercise such restraint when it comes to their feelings, especially feelings like grief. And so when I say I don't like Gray Jedi, I mainly mean I don't like the belief held by some fans that it is the correct way for the Force to be used by the Jedi. And I know there are plenty of fans who enjoy the concept and think it's the correct way and all of that, which is fine if that's how you feel, but I would argue George Lucas has clearly stated that's not the case. Anyway, here, all these things and more are covered in the new High Republic novel Into the Dark by Claudia Gray, along with the other form of Gray Jedi, the type that stray from the Council and sort of do their own thing. And we also get our first look and encounter with the Drenger, the new plant monster villains in Star Wars. But before I get too deep into all that, let me give you a quick spoiler-free review of the book in case you're considering reading it and you don't want everything ruined. And first of all, here you may want to point out that this book came out several weeks ago now, and that I'm a little late with this review. And the reason for that is when I start a new book, I tend to read the first 50 pages or so in my very first sitting to give it a fair shake one way or the other. And if it's really good, sometimes I'll just keep reading and have it done in a day or two, if not in that very first sitting on rare occasions, and time permitting, of course. And other times, I'll put the book down and never pick it back up again. And unfortunately, Into the Dark didn't hook me in those first 50 pages at all, so I set it down and there it stayed until, well, just a couple days ago. And the only reason I did pick it back up again was because when it comes to Star Wars books, for better or worse, I always finish them. I just power them out if I have to. And thankfully, in this particular case, it did turn out to be for the better, because after a rather slow and dull start, I did come to enjoy the book. It wasn't fantastic. It's certainly not Claudia Gray's best Star Wars book overall, but I still enjoy the story itself for the most part. And though obviously set in the same time period and basically right on top of the book Light of the Jedi, which was the book that kicked off the High Republic era, this book was the opposite of that one in many respects. Because in that case, with Light of the Jedi, I mean, the book literally starts with a bang, and for the first 100 or so pages, they're dealing with this major hyperspace incident, and it really keeps you turning the pages. And although the pace and enjoyment of the book cools down a little bit after that, it remained largely enjoyable throughout, and the biggest problem I had, outside of some in-universe stuff, was that there were so many characters that it was hard to keep up or get vested in any particular one of them. It was clear that book was meant to set up a whole time period and more stories to come. Into the Dark was then, again, kind of the opposite. As mentioned, it had a slow start, but thankfully it had a much tighter narrative and focused on a much smaller group of characters, about a half dozen or so in total, and though none of them struck me as all too interesting at the start, By the end, I dare say I enjoyed and was vested in pretty much all of them. The story too does pick up at the end, but never elevated beyond just being a pretty good one in my opinion. In a lot of ways, this felt like a tease for bigger things to come. It also is a well-written book, other than a few lines that I couldn't stand and that struck me the wrong way. At one point, a character says something is cool as hell, and nothing really takes me out of Star Wars faster than modern world lingo, if you will. But anyway, other than a few lines like that, Claudia Gray writes Star Wars very well. She's good at capturing the feel of it. And so overall, a pretty good book that leaves me feeling like there's still plenty of hope for the High Republic era, even if I did have some in-universe issues with it, which means it's time to move into spoiler territory. So if you're going to read this book or are thinking about reading it, it's probably a good time to click away unless you don't care about major plot points being ruined. Okay, so to get into the nuts and bolts of it, the basic premise of the book, leaving out some details of course, is that after the big hyperspace incident that we see at the start of Light of the Jedi, which basically shuts down all hyperspace travel, a small group of 4 Jedi and a couple smugglers essentially, who are on their way to the frontier are forced to make an emergency exit out of hyperspace and find this ancient space station that was built by an advanced but now extinct race known as the Amaxan. Along with some other refugees also forced out of hyperspace, they take shelter on this station from a sun that's spewing out deadly waves of radiation and decide to wait it out until they get the all clear that hyperspace is safe for travel again. And for whatever reason, they find that this station is overgrown with plant life. Furthermore, there are signs that the station has not only been visited recently, but is being used by what essentially amounts to a shipping guild. And one of the smugglers ferrying the Jedi to the Outer Rim is the adopted daughter of the leader of this very guild, which is part of the book's B-plot that I probably won't touch much on. Anyway, while here on this station, the Jedi all have premonitions that feel like warnings, and they come to realize that there is something strong with the dark side here, which they come to believe are these 4 statues, essentially. They then decide they can't leave the statues here, that they're too dangerous, and they decide to take them back to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where they can be studied after the dark side energy has been drained away from them, which can be done via a Virgin's Point under the temple, which is where the Sith had once built a shrine as well. Problem is, the statues weren't what the dark side were infesting or possessing, if you will, but rather they were keeping the real problem in check, which are the Drenger, aka plant monsters that I'll talk much more about in a bit. We also learn it was the Sith who originally imprisoned the Drenger on this station, though we get no sort of details about how that happened or why. We also come to learn that this station has a unique power source and that there are these pods that can be used to very quickly, nearly instantly it seems, travel anywhere across the galaxy, which the Nihil, the bad guys from the Light of the Jedi, the Space Vikings, will soon become very interested in because a few of their kind are among the refugees on the station, though the Jedi don't know that. Long story short, the Jedi take the statues back to the temple on Coruscant, realize their mistake, and then plan to take the statues back to the station to re-imprison whatever evil they were holding at bay, assuming it's not already too late. But when they get there, they come to find that the Nihil are trying to take the station for themselves. A battle ensues, and during this battle, one of the Jedi accidentally takes one of these pods to somewhere else in the galaxy, discovers what appears to be the Drenger's homeworld, but then quickly escapes them, rescuing another Jedi in the process, one they thought had died on their initial visit, that he'd been vaporized, but had actually used a pod and traveled to the Drenger's home planet and been captured. Anyway, these 2 Jedi make it back to the station, but are followed back by the Drenger. But the Jedi, after learning these Drenger are all but immune to lightsabers, that they can quickly regrow themselves if cut with one, manages to find a way to vaporize them before sending all these pods to random parts of the galaxy with no way of getting back, so that no one can use them for a tactical advantage. And in the end, the Drenger that was released on the station, or were released on the station, along with plenty of the Nihil, are blown out of an airlock, and all seems to end well. Again, a bit more to it than that, but that is the gist of it. And like I said, the story itself was enjoyable enough, and I didn't see the twist coming that the statues were holding the darkness in place and not the actual darkness, even though I should have, because it should have been obvious they were restraining the Drenger. The interesting parts, or the parts worth discussing more though, were then the Drenger themselves and the Jedi main characters and their stories, or the thoughts on the Jedi way that they had, I should say. And so let's start with the Drenger. And I gotta say, plant monsters are always going to be a tough sell in my book. They're something that personally I have a hard time finding scary, maybe because I just see a little shop of horrors in my head when I think about it. And the Drenger were even described to have fly trap-like mouths, so that really didn't help. Anyway, keeping in mind one of the taglines of this whole High Republic project or time period is, what would scare a Jedi? What I was hoping for out of the Drenger was maybe a cross between, or something that drew inspiration from the Flood from Halo, and something more Lovecraftian in nature, some ancient cosmic horror or a malevolent type of consciousness that grew and took over and kind of consumed entire planets. And though they do seem to be maybe something like that, or could end up being something like that, again, we didn't learn much about them in this story. I just personally couldn't take them all too seriously. Just the way they talked was a bit off-putting, always talking about wanting meat and like they were gloating about how amazing they were. And actually, I wish they hadn't talked at all, that they would appear to be sort of individually mindless, yet driven by some central malevolent consciousness, like they were some sort of malignant growth of the dark side itself, like they were a cancer that spread from world to world and consumed all other life, which again is maybe what they kind of are or will end up being. We're told that they have an extremely strong connection to the dark side, and again, even learn that it was the Sith that had originally imprisoned them, not the Jedi, and that's about all we learned. Moving on to the Jedi characters then, one of them is something called a Way Seeker, which is essentially a Jedi who no longer follows the ways of the Council, and instead sets out on their own path to form a stronger attachment to the Force itself, to be guided solely by it. And this is an interesting thing to add because, well, that's essentially what Qui-Gon Jinn is or is presented as in The Phantom Menace. And again, in my personal opinion here, I don't like the idea that this is something that basically formally exists. Wayseekers are even recognized by the Council as a legitimate thing, and that it exists 200 years before the prequels. Because, when you really think about it, this means the Jedi of this time period should know they are in the wrong. A few minutes of reflection and they should be asking why all Jedi don't just listen to the will of the Force. They should ponder what's the point of having a council if it interferes with interpreting what the Force wants. Which is basically the question this character grapples with in the book, though it's kind of slowly revealed through flashbacks that are spaced out throughout the story, where we learn that 25 years prior, if she just followed her instincts, followed the Force, or how it was trying to guide her, she would have been able to save 2 prisoners or hostages in this particular scenario. But since she followed the way of the Jedi, she did as the Jedi were supposed to, one of the hostages ended up being killed. And don't get me wrong here, I think this is a fascinating question to address, and I absolutely think one of the problems with the Jedi of the prequel era is that they follow the Jedi way or the Jedi code, and not the will of the Force. Not that the two are mutually exclusive, only that sometimes a Jedi needs to follow their instincts instead of following a strict or rigid set of rules. This again is what Qui-Gon Jinn basically shows us in the prequels. He follows his instincts, even when they conflict with the code. And so having this type of Jedi, this Wayseeker, being recognized, being like an official thing the Jedi know about and endorse 200 years prior to Qui-Gon Jinn and the prequels, makes no sense to me. Again, it's like the Jedi acknowledging and admitting they know they're doing things wrong, that they should be following the will of the Force, but they're following their own code anyway. I guess, or hope, that this is to show how arrogant they truly are at this time period, and why 200 years later they'll lose their ability to use the Force to the fullest. Another thing this book then addresses through the Jedi characters is attachment, and mainly in the form of grief and how they deal with or are supposed to deal with grief. There's this resentment from one of the Jedi characters that he's basically not supposed to grieve for his fallen Jedi, and he's not supposed to truly care about them anymore, and the book very much implies that the Jedi of this time are completely suppressing their feelings. And as I've discussed many times before in videos, it's not that the Jedi suppress their feelings, it's that they don't give in to them. There's a big difference between the two. Jedi have emotions, they accept that. They even have friends and all that other good stuff, but they don't allow themselves to get attached to another person or to a thing. They don't put anything else on a pedestal above the greater good. And so what I'm really hoping is that this book is trying to show us how the Jedi of this time period are flawed by trying to deny their emotions instead of learning to handle them, which is sort of the flaw that carries on through to the prequels. But honestly, I really thought this was something the sequel trilogy should have covered. They should have addressed the whole attachment thing after Luke and Anakin, asking if it was right for the Jedi to have them or not, but instead it never got close to addressing anything like that. Also here in this book, the question of why is the dark side so bad is asked by some of the characters. They ponder if they should be using both sides of the Force. And it's a little hard to know if this is just characters from an in-universe perspective asking these questions, but ultimately being wrong about that. And again, I'm fine if that is something they want to explore. Or if this book is trying to itself imply these Jedi were right and the ultimate failure of the Jedi is being too blinded by the light and ignoring the dark. Which, as I argued earlier in the video, I do not think is the case. Well, not entirely anyway, because again, I do think the Jedi of the prequel era and before got too wrapped up in the Jedi way and lost sight of the Force itself, or the will of the Force. And so in closing here, Into the Darkness starts slow but eventually becomes a pretty solid story. But its characters and the inner thoughts and views that they share are the most interesting aspect of the book. Though that said, I do hope that they're not implying these characters are right about certain aspects of the Force. The Drengir are, right now, less than impressive, but perhaps when we see and learn more about them, they'll become better and far more interesting than they are now. And so all in all, it was a decent Star Wars book, and I am still interested in more from the High Republic era. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you read Into the Darkness, and what did you think about it? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.